Mr. President, Americans across the country have been riveted by the crisis occurring on our southern border. President Obama is correct with one regard. What we are seeing is a humanitarian crisis. But it is a crisis, sadly, of the president's own creation. And it is the direct consequence of President Obama's lawlessness. To understand why, one merely has to look at the numbers. 3 years ago, in 2011, there were roughly 6,000 unaccompanied children entering the country illegally. Then in 2012, in June of 2012, just before the election, the president unilaterally granted amnesty to some 800,000 people who are here illegally, who entered as children. Now, the direct foreseeable consequence of that, the predicted consequence of that, if you grant amnesty to people who enter as children, you create an enormous incentive for more and more children to enter the country illegally. And that is exactly what we have seen happen. As a result of the president's amnesty, we have seen the numbers go from 6,000 kids 3 years ago to this year. It is expected that there will be 90,000 unaccompanied children entering the country illegally. And next year, the Department of Homeland Security predicts it will be 145,000. Now, Mr. President, I've traveled down to the border in Texas many times. As recently as in the last couple of months, I've been down to McAllen. I've visited with the Border Patrol chief in McAllen. I've visited with the Border Patrol agents, the line agents down there. I've been to Lackland Air Force Base, where there are roughly 1,200 children being housed. I'm sorry to say that President Obama, when he visited Texas, had time to do neither. He had time to go to Democratic Party fundraisers, to pal around with fat cats in the Democratic Party and to raise money, but no time to travel to the border and see the human suffering that his failed immigration policies have produced. And it's worth underscoring, Mr. President, these are little boys and little girls who are not being brought into this country by well-meaning social workers with beards and Birkenstocks trying to help the kids. They are being brought in by hardened drug coyotes, cartels, and these little boys and little girls are being physically victimized, physically abused, sexually abused. When I was at Lackland Air Force Base, a senior official there described to me how these cartels, when they have control of these kids and are smuggling them illegally into this country, sometimes they will hold the kids hostage and try to extract more money from the families. And in order to do so, horrifyingly, they will sever body parts from these kids. And this senior official at Lackland described to me how these coyotes would put a gun to the back of the head of a little boy or little girl and order that child to cut off the fingers or the ears of another little boy or little girl. And if they don't do it, they would shoot that child and move on to the next one. And they described how on this end, we're getting, number one, some children who have been horribly maimed by these vicious coyotes. And number two, we're getting children who have enormous psychological trauma from being forced to participate in such horrors. Mr. President, you cannot solve the crisis at the border without ending the promise of amnesty. Now, the data demonstrate that compellingly. It was when the president granted amnesty that the numbers spiked. But the more recent data demonstrate that as well. Just a few months ago, the Border Patrol conducted a survey of over 200 people who'd entered the country illegally, many of them children, and asked the obvious question, why are you coming? What's changed? Just 3 years ago, it was only 6,000 kids. Now it's 90,000. What has changed? 95% of them told the Border Patrol they were coming because they believe they will get amnesty. They believe they will get a permiso, a slip of paper that lets them stay once they get here. When I was in McAllen, I took the time not just to meet with the chief, but to meet with a number of the Border Patrol agents who spend every day out in the river, up in the air, on horseback, working to secure the borders. And I asked the line agents the obvious question: why are they coming? What has changed? What has caused this humanitarian crisis? Every single Border Patrol agent gave me the exact same answer. They said they're coming because they believe they'll get amnesty. In fact, Mr. President, they explained to me, they said right now the Border Patrol is not apprehending these kids. When they cross the river, they often have nothing, sometimes just rags on their back, after a long, arduous journey where they've been subjected to horrible physical and sexual abuse. But the one thing they almost inevitably have is their documents. And these children immediately look for the first person in a uniform they can find. The Border Patrol isn't apprehending them, they're looking for the Border Patrol. Because they come to the Border Patrol and they hand them their documents. Because they believe they will get amnesty, they will get a permiso, they will be allowed to stay. If we want to solve this crisis, if we want to stop these children from coming and from being abused, the only way to do so is to end the promise of amnesty. Now, before the August recess, I introduced legislation in this body to do exactly that. It was very simple legislation. It was directed to the source of the problem. It provided in black and white law that the President of the United States prospectively has no authority to grant amnesty to anyone. The legislation doesn't address the 800,000 who were the subject of the 2012 order. It simply says, going forward, the President cannot grant amnesty to anyone else. And the reason for that is the cause of this crisis is these children coming believe they will get amnesty. Now, the White House, in their talking points, routinely says the children coming today are not eligible for amnesty. I see my colleague from Illinois nodding in agreement with that statement. If that is the case, then my colleague from Illinois should join me in sponsoring this measure, because the legislation I've introduced would simply put into law what the White House talking point is, which is that I would be happy to yield for a question.
Can the gentleman tell me what the cutoff date is for eligibility for DACA?
DACA, I don't have the precise cutoff date in my mind, but the point that is being raised is these children don't fall under the precise terms of DACA, but they believe so. The only way to correct that, I would respond to my friend from Illinois. Does my friend from Illinois believe these children who are coming today should get amnesty, yes or no?
No. I just say, if I might, through the chair, that is not the argument anyone is making, that these children should receive amnesty. What we're saying is they should be treated humanely.
Absolutely.
And go through an orderly legal process, which will result in the vast majority of them returning to their countries. But what the gentleman from Texas is asking us to do is to disqualify up to 2 million young people who are here in the United States and could qualify for DACA as dreamers. People who were here long before these unaccompanied children showed up at the border. And that was the proposal that came before the House, which you inspired them to vote for, and they stood with a standing ovation because they denied an opportunity to 2 million young people in this country to be able to stay here without fear of deportation. That's what you're asking for today.
I thank my friend from Illinois, but I would note that the comments that he made are not connected to the facts of the proposal. The proposal is explicitly prospective. Some 800,000 people have already received amnesty. Now, let's be clear. The President had no legal authority to grant amnesty at the time. He did so unilaterally, contrary to rule of law. Now, we are in a broader context where the President has quite publicly promised to grant amnesty, again unilaterally and illegally, to some 5 or 6 million people. And yet, at the behest of our friends on the Democratic side of the aisle, he announced this weekend that he's delaying the decision until after the election because apparently Senate Democrats up for election have noticed their constituents don't support the president illegally and unilaterally granting amnesty. Now, I would suggest members of this body can't have it both ways. My friend from Illinois stated that he doesn't think we should be granting amnesty to these children. And yet, the legislation that I introduced, the legislation that the House of Representatives passed, does not act retroactively. It does not address anyone who's fallen within the previous DACA. It simply says, going forward, the president doesn't have the authority to grant amnesty. Instead, it is Congress that has the authority to pass or not pass immigration laws.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I'm happy to.
I'd like to ask the gentleman this question. If amnesty means that a person has a right to citizenship or legal status on a permanent basis, is the gentleman from Texas suggesting that the deferral of deportation under DACA is that kind of amnesty?
The deferral of deportation under DACA is a written determination from the president that the individuals who receive this, number one, will be immune from the black letter text of the immigration law that subjects them to removal. And number two, the administration has created an authorization to work document as a component of DACA that has no basis or authority in existing federal law. And let us be clear. The president has been absolutely explicit. He intends to expand that to another 5 or 6 million people who are here illegally.
Would the gentleman yield for another question?
I will yield for question in a moment. The president intends to expand that to 5 or 6 million people who are here illegally, to give them presumably the same authorization to work, to unilaterally and with no authorization in law transfer their status from being illegally here to legally here on executive dispensation. Now, I understand that my friend from Illinois and that other members of the Democratic Party support that position, I believe, and I will allow him in his question in a minute to clarify that. If I've mischaracterized it, then I would certainly welcome his clarification. But there's certainly some members of the Democratic caucus who do support that. But the American people powerfully don't, profoundly don't. They recognize it's inconsistent with rule of law, it is bad policy, and it's creating this crisis at the border. And I have to say, the president's decision to delay the amnesty until right after the election reflects a cynicism that even in Washington, D.C. is unusual, because what it's saying is, I understand the policies that I, as President Obama, am trying to force are completely unpopular with the American people. So I'm going to jam them through right after the election, because what it reflects is that President Obama and unfortunately many of the Senate Democrats hold their constituents in very low regard. It reflects a view that if we do this after the election, even if the people don't like it, they'll forget about it in 2 years. If my friends in the Democratic Party believe the right policy solution is amnesty for 5 or 6 million more people, is the president acting unilaterally, then we have a very simple solution. Let's bring this up for a vote. Before the August recess, the House of Representatives took the legislation I had introduced in this body. They stayed over an extra day. They voted on it. They stood up and led, acting to solve the crisis at the border. And what happened in the Senate? The majority leader of the Senate refused to allow a vote on the proposal and sent every senator home for August while having done nothing to address this crisis. If my friend, the senator from Illinois, believes amnesty is the right policy decision, then let's have a debate, let's bring it up for a vote, and let's have every senator in this body go on record.
Senator, you for a question?
I'm happy to.
Most people believe that amnesty means a free pass. Whatever you've done, you can stay in the United States, you can become a citizen, and you become legal. So let me just say to the gentleman, the senator from Texas, that DACA is a temporary suspension of deportation. It is temporary. It has to be renewed. And in order to qualify for it, you must have been in the United States as of June 15, 2007. What we have now are 600,000, my number 600, you say 800, 600,000 who've come forward They have paid the fee, a substantial fee, and they are allowed to stay here without being subject to deportation on a temporary basis that needs to be renewed. There are another 2 million who may be eligible. And what you are doing is not addressing unaccompanied children at the border. You are saying to the remaining 2 million, you don't have a chance. You got to leave. You're illegal. You're going to be deported. This isn't about amnesty. It's about whether or not those who are qualified under the DREAM Act, which incidentally was endorsed by the House Republican caucus when they put out their statement of principles, whether those under the DREAM Act are going to have a chance to stay. And to think that your colleagues in the House stood and applauded themselves for denying to 2 million young people a chance to stay in the only country they've ever called home, to me doesn't speak well of that caucus or their sensitivity to the reality of their lives. These children were brought here by their parents, some as infants. They didn't vote on it. They were brought here. They have been raised in our schools. They have been taken care of in our hospitals. They pledge allegiance to the flag, as Senator Menendez says, every day. They pledge allegiance in the classroom in the only country they've ever known, and now you are glorying in the possibility that you can deport these children. Is that what you consider to be, in your own background? I'm a first-generation American. I believe in American. I believe you have a similar claim to make. Do you believe that's what this country is all about?
Well, I appreciate my friend from Illinois impugning the integrity of our friends in the House. And also describing the plight of immigrants. And as you rightly noted, 57 years ago, my father was an immigrant. He came from Cuba. He spoke no English. He had $100 sewn into his underwear. Now, he came here legally on a student visa to study. He followed the rule of law. And I would note, as my friend from Illinois knows full well, legal immigration in the U.S. Senate than I am. Indeed, on the Senate Judiciary Committee, I introduced 2 amendments. One for high-skilled workers, H-1B workers, to increase that cap 5-fold from 65,000 to 325,000. Because temporary high-skilled workers are pro-growth, every one of those who comes produces 1.7 American jobs. And I'm sorry to say that my friend from Illinois and every single Senate Democrat on the Judiciary Committee voted against that proposal. Voted against increasing legal immigration for temporary high-skilled workers. Now, my friend from Illinois is also aware, on the same Senate Judiciary Committee, I introduced another amendment to take our current failed legal immigration system, to dramatically simplify it, to reduce the barriers, to reduce the costs, to eliminate the per-country caps, which have the effect of discriminating against nations like Mexico and China and India, and to take the legal cap from 675,000 and to double it to 1.35 million, so we can have a legal system that we can continue to welcome and celebrate legal immigrants who come here to seek the American dream. And again, I was sorry to see every single Senate Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee vote against increasing legal immigration, streamlining it, making the system work better, and eliminating the discriminatory per-country caps on nations like Mexico and India and China. I understand that the senator from Illinois just gave a passionate speech in defense of granting amnesty to people who are here illegally. He is certainly entitled to those views. We should indeed have a full and robust debate. But I would note that the Democratic senator from Arkansas, the Democratic senator from Louisiana, the Democratic senator from North Carolina, the Democratic senator from Alaska are all busily telling their constituents that they disagree with what my friend from Illinois just said. They are at home telling their constituents, no, 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 we don't want amnesty. No, 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 we don't want the president to unilaterally grant amnesty. Now, if that is indeed their position, I would welcome them to come to the... And if that is indeed their position, there is an easy action. For centuries, this body has been called the world's greatest deliberative body. Unfortunately, that label is no longer accurately applied because this body, sadly, under Majority Leader Reid and the Democratic majority, neither deliberates nor votes on much of anything. There are over 350 bills the House of Representatives has passed to address the great challenges in this country, mostly with substantial bipartisan support in the House of Representatives, and over 350 pieces of legislation are sitting on Harry Reid's desk, and he will not allow a vote on them. When it comes to solving the crisis at the border, the only way to do so is to end the promise of amnesty. The 90,000 children who are coming believe when they get here they will get amnesty. The position, sadly, of President Obama and the majority leader and the Senate Democrats is that they will do nothing, zero, to fix that problem. And let me say, it is not compassionate. It is not humane to continue a system where tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of little boys and little girls are being victimized or being assaulted physically and sexually by violent coyotes. And under the Democratic plan, that will continue. It will continue this year, it will continue next year, and in response, they do nothing, zero, nada. The problem. That is a hard-hearted approach to this challenge. We have a demonstration, a study in contrast. Looking at a humanitarian crisis, the House of Representatives stood up and voted on legislation to make clear in law the President of the United States has no authority to grant amnesty to people who are here illegally. The Senate had a chance to do the same thing. Now, President Obama has promised the American people right after the election he intends to unilaterally and illegally grant amnesty to another 5 or 6 million people. Every Senate Democrat has an opportunity to make clear where he or she stands. I am in a moment going to ask for this body to take up the bill that the House has passed to make clear in law that the President has no authority to grant amnesty prospectively. I understand that my Democratic friends are going to object to this. That should surprise no one, because my Democratic friends for the last 2 years have objected to considering almost every major piece of legislation to address the challenges in this country. And what this means is that the 55 Democrats in this body who are standing united in blocking this legislation that the House of Representatives has passed, all 55 Democrats bear responsibility for President Obama's amnesty, for the amnesty of 5 or 6 million people. And I understand the President thinks it's politically clever to delay the amnesty until after the election, but I'll tell you, I have real faith in the American people that it's too clever by half, that all 55 Senate Democrats, in standing together, standing united with President Obama, saying, we want the President to have the ability to illegally grant amnesty. Every Senate Democrat in this body bears responsibility for that choice. If they did not, any Senate Democrat is welcome to come. And I would note, Mr. President, there is one Senate Democrat on the Senate floor, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, who I expect momentarily will object to this. There is not a single Democrat in this chamber speaking out for eliminating the President's authority to grant amnesty. Clarity in elections, enabling the American people to hold all of us accountable, is a very, very good thing. One body, the House of Representatives, is leading. The other body, the United States Senate, under Democratic control, refuses to even allow a vote on solving the crisis at the border or stopping the President's illegal amnesty. Therefore, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 551, H.R. 5272. I further ask consent that the bill be read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. Let me first respond to the unanimous consent request from the senator from Texas, the son of immigrants himself, to prohibit certain actions with respect to deferred action for students in the United States that we call dreamers. Dreamers. These are young people who, as Senator Durbin said, the only flag pledge allegiance to is that of the United States. The only national anthem they have ever sung is the Star-Spangled Banner. They came to this country not because they made a decision to do so, but because their parents, as Senator Cruz's parents came here, and ultimately he enjoys the benefit of being in America. Different time, different set of circumstances, but nonetheless, he didn't have a choice in that decision. Neither did these children. And so we have learned, and we have often heard in this chamber, that you never subscribe to the child whatever errors exist of the parent. But that's exactly what the senator from Texas would do. Now, my friend from Texas is entitled to his views and his opinions, but he is not entitled to his own set of facts. The reality is that he continuously refers to the deferred action on deportation for these young people as amnesty. Amnesty suggests that you are forgiven for something that you did wrong, and you have a clear pathway to permanent residency and ultimately to United States citizenship. That is not what the president did when he offered these young people who know no other country than the United States the situation in which they would not be deported. Their action would be deferred until the Congress acted on the pressing question of immigration reform. Now, the senator from Texas suggests that the Senate has failed in leadership. And I would say to the senator from Texas that the Senate exerted leadership over a year ago when, in broad bipartisan votes, notwithstanding the senator from Texas, in broad bipartisan votes, a group of 8 senators, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, joined together and got 2/3 of the United States Senate to send comprehensive immigration reform to the House of Representatives. Common sense immigration reform that was the toughest on border protection that has existed in the history of the country, that was in the national security interests of the United States, that provided for the economic imperative as described by the Congressional Budget Office of the opportunities that immigration reform would provide for the country. Raising the gross domestic product of the United States, raising the wages of all Americans, reducing the national debt, all by virtue of immigration reform. That 2/3 of the Senate, at a time that it is rare to see 2/3 of the Senate come together on controversial or significant issues of the day, sent to the House of Representatives over a year ago. And they could not find themselves once to cast a vote on that legislation or their own vision of what immigration reform should be. So I'd be happy to do so a little later. At the end of the day, the senator from Texas argues that this measure is necessary to deal with the humanitarian crisis at the border. I would say that has gone dramatically in a downward slope. And he may argue that immigration policy is driving these children to make a dangerous and deadly journey. And while I agree that we need a long-term solution to the humanitarian crisis on the southern border, saying that this opportunity for dreamers to stay in the United States is the cause is simply not true. DACA, which is the law we refer to that the president did by administrative order, was announced in June of 2012. The influx of unaccompanied minors was reported months before that announcement. As a matter of fact, you can ask Senator Cruz's own governor, Rick Perry, who sent a letter warning of the influx of children months before the president's DACA announcement. The fact is that all of this talk about ending deferred action for children who have been here sometimes well over a decade or more ignores the elephant in the room, is that DACA does not cover these children. It only covers children who were brought here before the announcement was made. Eliminating DACA, as the senator from Texas would have, would not make any of these children less likely to come. These are children who are fleeing extreme violence. Violence in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Honduras, which have some of the highest murder rates per capita in the world. If I see my father killed in front of me and my sister raped, it is likely that I will think about trying to flee that set of circumstances regardless of what the promise might or might not be. And that is, in fact, what drove this humanitarian crisis. So we should solve the roots of the crisis, not try to create some connection to something that has absolutely nothing to deal with it. Now, I know we're in the season in which even if 10 angels came swearing from above that DACA is not the cause of the unaccompanied minor circumstances, or in that it is not amnesty, there will be those who would say, no, those angels are wrong. The reality is, one is entitled to their views, but not their facts. Finally, the undeniable consequence of the senator's attempt to dismantle these deferred action for dreamers would serve only to further separate families. And I've listened time and time again to my Republican colleagues talk about they are the party of family values. Well, tearing apart families is not my sense of a family value. Tearing children away from their mothers and fathers is not my sense of family value. Destroying any hope of a better life and a chance at success is not the doctrine of family values. Mr. President, there's a reason the Senate hasn't voted on this bill, and it won't. And it won't. I think the Senate Democratic leadership understands it would be a disservice to our country, a disservice to hundreds of thousands of these young people who we have already invested in through our public schools. Now is the time to take advantage of their service, whether in the military of the United States or whether through their intellect. Some of them are the valedictorians and salutarians of our schools and colleges and universities. It is an opportunity to ensure that they can be productive members of our society with no guarantee as it relates to their ultimate status. And I hope that the immigrant community in this country, I hope the Hispanic community in this country, I hope the Asian Indian community in this country, I hope the Eastern European community in this country, all who are rightly concerned about comprehensive immigration reform, are listening to this debate. Because as disappointed as you may be about the president saying, well, we cannot move forward at this time until we get it right because of the politics that have been generated by the undocumented children along the border. As disappointed as you may be with the president, listen to what you will get if, in fact, this November there is a change of who ultimately has a majority in this chamber. This is what you will get. This is what you will get, and you will get what you got in the House of Representatives, which is over a year of not casting one vote for their own vision of immigration reform. And every vote that they have cast has been anti-immigrant at the end of the day. Mr. President, for all those reasons, I have to object to the unanimous consent request.
Will the senator yield?
The objection is heard.
I'd be happy.
The senator from New Jersey talked about legislation that was debated and voted on a year ago. Legislation that I believe, if it had been passed into law, would only make the problem worse, would only increase illegal immigration, would only exacerbate the problem. I, like most Americans, want to see common sense immigration reform, but not reform that fails to secure the border that grants a pathway to citizenship for those here illegally, that incentivizes further and further illegal immigration. But that legislation was a year ago. The President of the United States tells us we have a humanitarian crisis on the border today, right now, not a year ago, today, with little boys and little girls being subjected to physical and sexual violence and being victimized. Question I would ask my friend from New Jersey: why is it that neither President Obama nor the Senate Democrats have introduced any legislation or allowed a vote on any legislation whatsoever that would actually solve the problems? Now, the President did introduce a $3.7 billion social services spending bill, less than 5% of which went to securing the border, and none of which went to the underlying amnesty that's causing this crisis. That was a bill designed to deal with the symptoms, to care for the kids once they come, but that bill assumed that tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of kids would continue to come, continue to be victimized. So the question I ask my friend from New Jersey: why have the Democrats not allowed a vote on anything to solve the problem and prevent these little boys and little girls from being victimized this year and next year and the year after that?
Mr. President, first of all, I would say to my friend from Texas that he totally mischaracterizes the comprehensive bipartisan immigration reform that was passed in the Senate. You know who voted for that? A whole host of senators on the Republican side of the aisle who represent border states, and who said this is the most significant border protection and security effort we have had in a long time, who believed that the national security of the United States was better preserved by virtue of that legislation. John McCain, a colleague who worked assiduously on that question, as well as others. And so, you know, the bottom line is that reform was going to end the process of undocumented, those coming in an undocumented fashion, control the border, move the economy, bring out of the darkness those who are here to pursue the American dream, which is the only way I can secure America, to differentiate them from those who might be here to do harm to the United States. I can't know that if people are in the darkness, don't come and register with the government, pay their taxes, go through a criminal background check, and earn their way over the course of a decade to the possibility of becoming a permanent resident. That's what the Senate did. So failure in this regard rests in the House of Representatives. Failure on the border, failure on the national security, failure on the economy, and failure to reunite millions of people with their families. Now, with reference to the second part of your question, the president acted. It's the president who brought the Central American presidents here and said, you've got to work with us to stop your young children from coming to our country, and you've got to create better conditions in your country. And we want to work with you to do that. That worked with Mexico to ensure that what they call the beast, the train of death, ultimately Mexican authorities interceded to stop immigrants from getting on that train to the United States. It's the president who ultimately took the resources that existed in the Department of Homeland Security and reauthorized it to send it to the border and deal with the challenge. And all of that, among other efforts, ultimately has found us with a dramatic reduction. So I understand the politics of this, and I appreciate everybody in this chamber has the right to pursue that. But the bottom line is the president acted. The reality is we have dramatically reduced, and the core challenge here is to have comprehensive immigration reform. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I'd like to make two final comments in response to this exchange. The first is that my friend from New Jersey admitted that Senate Democrats introduced nothing, zero, nada, to do anything to fix this humanitarian crisis. Indeed, that the majority leader dismissed the Senate and sent the senators home for the month of August, perfectly content to let the crisis continue, to let tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of children be victimized. He suggested instead the solution was presidential action, unilateral action. You know, there was a time when the Senate believed we had a responsibility to do something, to actually pass laws to address challenges. And yet, under the Senate Democrats, we have a do-nothing Senate. That's why over 350 bills passed by the House of Representatives are sitting on Harry Reid's desk. Because this body no longer votes on meaningful legislation to address the challenges facing this country. I would note additionally that my friend from New Jersey suggested that the reason the legislation the House of Representatives passed prohibiting the president from illegally granting amnesty, the reason it's not going to come up for a vote is because he said it's a bad idea. Well, I recognize the senator from New Jersey may well think that. Indeed, the senator from Illinois may well think that. But no one who's paying attention to the Senate thinks that's the reason it's not coming up for a vote. If it were objectively a bad idea, and the Democrats agreed on that, bringing it up for a vote would be very simple. You'd bring it up for a vote. The Democrats have 55 Democrats in this body. They could all vote it down. It would be defeated. If the point were on the merits, it's a bad idea, bringing it up for a vote would be very straightforward. The reason the majority leader is fighting so hard to prevent a vote on this is that a great many of the members in his caucus are doing everything in their power to convince their constituents back home they don't support amnesty. You know, as you travel the country, the most frequent thing you hear all throughout the country is that the men and women in Washington, they aren't listening to us. Something happens, I don't know if it's the water or what it is, but they get to Washington, they stop listening to us, and they don't tell us the truth. They're lying to us. And you hear this from Republicans, from Democrats, independents, libertarians, all across this country. There is a reason why the popularity of Congress rivals that of Ebola. Because the American people recognize the people in this body aren't telling them the truth. There is one reason and one reason only that Majority Leader Reid does not want to vote on this legislation. Because he wants to allow senators in red states, the senator from Arkansas, the senator from Louisiana, the senator from North Carolina, the senator from Alaska, even the senator from Colorado, even the senator from New Mexico. He wants to allow them to tell their constituents, no, I don't support amnesty. And the reality is, of the 55 members of this Senate who are Democrats, who caucus with the Democratic Party, today has been conclusively demonstrated that all 55 support President Obama's illegal amnesty and are responsible for his promised amnesty of 5 to 6 million more people right after the election. If that were not the case, you would have seen one Democrat show up and speak out to the contrary. Not a single Democrat showed up. And there's a reason we don't have a vote, because if we had a vote, it would force members of this body to be on record. The senator from New Jersey is entitled to make the case on the merits why he thinks amnesty for 5 million or 6 million or 12 million is a good idea. He's entitled to make that case, and if his constituents agree with him, he'll keep getting reelected. But far too many Senate Democrats want to pretend they disagree, and a vote makes that impossible, because if we had a vote, you would see all 55 Senate Democrats vote in favor of amnesty. They're right now hiding behind their leadership because they don't want that vote. They don't want their constituents to understand they support amnesty. So instead, they shut this body down. I have to say, the American people are frustrated. They are disgusted with the Senate that won't do its job, that won't allow votes, that won't consider legislation to address the problems in this. and that consistently lies to the voters. I'll tell you, on my side of the aisle, I'm happy to have as many votes as we like. You know, it is interesting. The Senate Majority Leader today seems to view as his principal obligation protecting his members from hard votes. And I'd like to point out the concept of a hard vote only makes sense if there's a disconnect between what a senator says at home and what he or she does in Washington. Votes are hard if you have Democratic senators who go home to their states and tell their constituents, I'm really conservative. I don't agree with that crazy stuff President Obama's doing. And then they come here and vote lockstep with the Majority Leader and the President. Then votes are hard. I'll tell you from my perspective, I don't consider votes hard. In 2 years, what I've tried to do in the Senate is very simple. Two things. Do what I said I would do and tell the truth. The 26 million Texans who I represent, I believe, understood the principles that I'm defending when they elected me. And whether we have one vote or 10 or 100 or 1,000, it doesn't surprise the men and women back home, because what I say in Texas is exactly the same as what I say on the floor of the Senate. It's the way I've tried to vote since I arrived here. The reason the Majority Leader has 350 plus bills sitting on his desk is because a substantial number of Senate Democrats tell their constituents one thing and vote a different way. This is all predicated on deception. And so I'm glad for this exchange, because this exchange has shined light and made clear to the voters, number one, that amnesty is coming, that President Obama intends to grant amnesty to 5 to 6 million Americans right after the election. And number two, that all 55 Senate Democrats bear direct responsibility for President Obama's illegal amnesty, because all 55 Senate Democrats are standing in lockstep preventing legislation that would stop that amnesty. That clarity is good. It allows accountability. It allows decision-making to be made by we, the people. And the one thing I would encourage of my Democratic friends is, given that reality, go home and be honest with your constituents. All 55 of you, go home and say, yes, I stand with President Obama. I stand with Majority Leader Harry Reid in support of amnesty. Those are not the views of the American people, but they are the views of every Democratic senator in this body. And we have a natural check when elected officials ignore the views and values of the people for whom we work, of the place where sovereignty resides in our system, we the people. Mr. President, I yield the floor. I would note the absence of a quorum.